We are back, and we are joined now by Gregory Brew, senior analyst at Eurasia Group, focusing on Iran and energy. Gregory, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me on.
So, can you give everybody we did this a little bit on Thursday of last week, but gosh, the story is moving so rapidly. Can you just give people a bit of a primer on the different actors here? Basically, like how Assad was connected to Russia and Iran, and then also really like the different allegiances with these major rebel groups from within Syria right now.
Sure thing. So, not complicated at all. If you go back to the bygone days of 2 weeks ago, you had the Assad regime, which controlled, most of the country following the civil war that ended in a basic stalemate in 2020 with a ceasefire. Assad was, of course, propped up by Iran and Russia. And when I say propped up, I really do mean everyone recognized that he didn't have much of a basis inside the country. He wasn't popular. The Assad government was brutally repressive. It had some basis of support in the Alawite community, which is an ethnic religious minority within Syria, mostly located on the west coast. That's where Assad drew most of his support from. But the rest of Syria hated him as a brutal dictator. He really relied on Russia and Iran to provide the military support that he needed to keep the country under his control. Now, beyond that, there were rebel groups that were operating out of the city of Idlib in the north of Syria. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, was one of the largest and most powerful of these groups. It was running the city of Idlib with a certain degree of Turkish support, although honestly, HTS was mostly running its own show. HTS was formerly an affiliate of al-Qaeda. It emerged from the Syrian civil war as a Sunni jihadist group, pretty radical group. But for the last couple of years, HTS had kind of consciously moderated its tone a little bit, tried to create the sort of sense that it was working towards a nationally unified Syria, not necessarily one that would be run by jihadist beliefs. You also had some other factions. The Syrian National Army was a bunch of original factions that have been kind of grouped under a Turkish umbrella, the SNA as they're known, mostly run by Turkey or observant to Turkish direction. And then finally the Kurds, the SDF, operating in the country's east. That was the status quo 2 weeks ago. Now, obviously, that status quo is completely gone. Yeah.
I just wanted to pull up a map so we can give a sense of how things have changed, not this one, the other two. So this was November 27th, and you can see here how, at least technically, the Syrian government forces, that big red one, this is Al Jazeera, thanks for this map, had control of the territory by that point. But with the SDF controlling, I guess that's like, a bit of the northeast region. But this is where we are at today as of December 8th. They've basically been completely pushed out. And you see how the Syrian opposition fighters have taken control over the majority of the territory there. Although, as you mentioned, the SDF, the Kurdish SDF, has expanded. It appears, or at least still controls, the northeast of the country.
Absolutely. Maps are really useful when it comes to the Syrian civil war.
I need it. I need a visual aid, or I can't digest this. But keep going.
We all do. Don't worry about it. The map is very useful because it illustrates the dramatic changes. The Assadist regime is gone. It's over. Assad is left. Most of the factions that had been, rising up against him in the final days have identified HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, as kind of the dominant faction. They appear to be running the show in Damascus. They're putting together an interim government. They've selected one of their politicians to serve as interim prime minister. And they seem to be in charge in Damascus, most of the country's west. Now, the situation with the Kurds in the east is actually very much in flux. The Kurds are fighting the Syrian National Army, the SNA, which has Turkish backing. Turkey is hostile towards the SDF. President Erdogan of Turkey wants to see the SDF pushed back. He wants a deal in place that removes any threat of an independent or even quasi-independent Kurdish state arising in Syria. And the new status quo in Syria will give him more means of doing that. So the Kurds in the SNA are currently fighting. And of course, there's ISIS. ISIS has not gone away. ISIS is still visible, still present in the Syrian desert. The U.S. has been bombing them heavily over the last couple of days to try to prevent some kind of ISIS resurgence. in the event that chaos or instability stems from the fall of the Assad regime. So it's a moving situation, lots of actors involved. I'll close by saying that there are two obvious losers here, apart from Assad, who is fled to Moscow. Iran has been kicked out of Syria. Syria was Iran's ally for 45 years. Assad was really their only reliable national leader in the region. Iran used Syria as a supply corridor to support its ally Hezbollah in Lebanon, which of course has been heavily weakened due to the war in Israel. And Syria was an important part of Iran's so-called axis of resistance. All of that is over now. They've been kicked out. They can't resupply Hezbollah. Their position across the Levant and Lebanon and Syria has been effectively destroyed. So Iran is the big loser. Russia looks to be a loser. Russia, of course, was also supporting Assad. Russia has two large military bases in the west of Syria along the coast. Right now the situation there is a little bit uncertain. It doesn't appear as though the Russians have withdrawn. But given that HTS is likely to look to Turkey for support and potentially even the Gulf Arab states, I would say that the odds of Russia eventually being forced out of Syria are pretty high.
And we should note that, at least the United States backs these Kurdish forces in many ways. The Syrian Democratic Forces is my understanding. Can you talk a little bit about the United States' role here, including the sanctions that were placed that may have had an effect on weakening Assad, but as you've mentioned, his position was quite weak already.
Sure thing. So on the question of the Kurds, the U.S. support for the Kurds really stems back to the beginning of the Syrian civil war. The Kurds, as a national movement within Syria, were a little bit more cohesive. They were able to form a united opposition against Assad's rule fairly quickly. But the war against ISIS made it even more imperative to support the Kurds, because the Kurds were very much on the front lines in 2014 to 2016, fighting ISIS, pushing back against the Islamic State. The United States provided largely air support for the Kurds to help them push back ISIS. There are around 900 U.S. troops in eastern Syria. The reason that they're there is to contain and combat ISIS while also providing support for the Kurds. And even as ISIS has receded as an issue, the U.S. has stayed put. We still have troops in Syria. They're still there supporting the Kurds. The question as to whether that support continues when Donald Trump becomes president next year is kind of the crucial question. Without U.S. air support, the Kurds will become much more vulnerable. Turkey will likely move against them more aggressively. Again, as I mentioned, Erdogan sees the threat of a Kurdish state in Syria as a major issue, a top priority for him. Moving back to the question of sanctions, you mentioned, yes, the U.S. and the international community had put Assad under very heavy sanctions. The Syrian economy is in a significantly dilapidated state. The Syrian government under Assad, mostly operated as a drug cartel. Most of their revenues were derived from moving drugs across the region or came in the form of aid from Iran. Iran was regularly sending funds to support Assad. So now that Assad is gone, I think the U.S. and others will be moving quickly to address the situation of sanctions. There's unlikely to be sanctions relief, but there may be attempts to lower the sanctions wall to allow at least humanitarian aid into Syria to prevent the situation from becoming even more unstable.
And to also, of course, that's a way to engender some goodwill in whoever takes control in the power vacuum here. And this is not something new that the United States has engaged in. We've covered many of their efforts on this front on the show previously. But I am curious about Iran's motivations here in not coming to Assad's defense. Iran is trying, I think, and this is my observations from the outside, trying to position itself as the linchpin in resistance to the United States and Israel and their belligerence in the region, and Israel slaughtering so many people in Gaza. We will get to the fact that Israel has taken some Syrian territory over the past 2 weeks. We'll put that aside for now. But given the fact that Iran just elected this reformer president, did the politics of supporting Assad, who was so brutal, who did kill so many of his own civilians, as they're trying to look like the center of the resistance to U.S. slaughter of U.S.-backed Israeli slaughter of a majority Muslim population, did that play into it, or is it more that Iran internally has its domestic situation is so weak and there's so much fighting in their own domestic political situation, that they just weren't in a position to help Assad?
Well, there's a couple of important, elements to consider when we look at how Iran has reacted to the fall of Assad, or should I say, the lack of Iranian reaction. Of course, as you noted, Iran did essentially nothing to prevent the fall of Assad, and we can get to why or how in just a moment. There was quite a lot of frustration with Assad in the days, in the months, even in the years before his collapse. Unfortunately, or perhaps not surprisingly, very little of it had to do with the brutality of his regime. The Iranian regime, the Islamic Republic, was growing frustrated with Assad because they saw him as a less than ideal client, a less than ideal ally. He did almost nothing to put pressure on Israel in the aftermath of October 7th as part of the sort of United Axis of Resistance campaign to try to pressure Israel following the Hamas attack. Assad mostly sat on the sidelines. There was very little activity from Syria to pressure Israel. At the same time, the Iranians were growing concerned that Assad was working sort of behind the scenes, was maybe going behind their backs, forging new ties with Gulf Arab states who were putting pressure on him, offering him economic incentives to pull himself and his regime away from Iran. There are widespread suspicions that Assad has been selling out Iran and selling out the positions of Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps officers to Israeli intelligence. There, of course, was the Israeli airstrike on the Iranian consulate back in April that killed a number of IRGC officers. It has been privately and now increasingly publicly speculated that Assad provided Israel with that intelligence. Now, these are all speculations. These are all accusations. But
can you say why he would do that, given the fact that Assad is an oppositional figure to the United States? Money?
Well, it goes to, so where Assad saw himself in the months before his sudden and unexpected collapse. Assad, he had been bailed out by the Iranians and the Russians. He had been saved. His position had stabilized by 2020. By 2022, there was growing interest, particularly in the Gulf, to normalize with him, to normalize relations with the Assad regime, to provide money to try to pull him away from Iran. And I think, this is, me sort of speculating here. I think Assad was looking for room to maneuver, to pull himself away from Tehran, to free himself from the yoke of Iranian control. And he was sort of trying to, work both sides against the middle. The Israeli element here, Israel had sort of an open secret, had a tremendous degree of intelligence penetration of the Syrian government, which we have now seen evidence of over the last few days as they've been bombing virtually every piece of Syrian military infrastructure. They've been able to do that because they know where all of it is, because they had intelligence operations running in Syria for years. So Assad was maybe trying to maneuver himself in a position that would benefit him and pull himself away from Iran. The Iranians were aware of that. Now, that does not mean, I don't think, that they let him go, that they sort of watched as HTS overran his positions and said, good riddance. The Iranians responded to the fall of Aleppo, I guess it was not even 2 weeks ago. They responded with concern, alarm. There was a diplomatic effort made to reach out to the Syrians. We now know that Iran's foreign minister went to Assad and said, your army has to, what's happening? Why aren't you putting up more of a fight? And I think as his position collapsed over the course of several days, I don't think the Iranians were really in a position to do much to stop it. They didn't have assets in position. Hezbollah was once a very powerful force within Syria and helped prop up Assad during the civil war, but Hezbollah was not in a position to deploy troops. Any troops that Iran could have deployed via Iraq, the militias that Iran has backed there, would have had to come in cooperation with the Iraqi government in Baghdad, and Baghdad was pushing back against those kinds of requests. And given the fact that the Syrian army was collapsing so quickly and that Assad didn't seem to have any support from inside the country, I think the argument likely prevailed that contributing resources to a battle that was already lost would have been a waste. So Iran let Assad go, perhaps in part because he had become a source of frustration and perhaps more of a liability than an asset. But I think they had to let him go because they had no alternative. Their position had become too weak. And as you note, their own domestic position is becoming increasingly insecure. The economy is poor. The regime is struggling with credibility and legitimacy issues. The current president, a reformist, as you note, Masoud Pezeshkian, has made it central to his message that Iran needs sanctions relief, that it needs economic support, and that perhaps, and I say perhaps because they don't say so publicly, but that perhaps expensive interventions and militias operating throughout the rest of the region are too much of a burden for Iran to maintain. So this all raises the question of what Iran is going to do in response to this crisis. There are a number of options available. One is trying to seek a deal to get sanctions relief for its economy. Another is to potentially find a new source of deterrence, a new source of security, now that the axis of resistance has crumbled. And they have an alternative in that regard, the nuclear program. So we're all watching very closely to see what might happen in that regard in 2025.
I mean, but good news for everybody. If Kamala Harris had gotten elected, and if it was as it was rumored that she was going to make her national security advisor, gosh, I'm forgetting that guy's name already, Phil Gordon, who had been integral in negotiating the Iran nuclear deal with under the Obama administration, that could have been a path forward with a reformist in office in Iran to avoiding like the development of Iran's nuclear weaponry, even though I know they're quite far along at this point. But we could have begun to have talks about re-entering and perhaps cooling tensions with Iran, with Marco Rubio and all these hawks being floated for Secretary of State under Donald Trump. Like, I'm immensely concerned that if Iran is growing more desperate under a sanctions regime that I don't believe will let up under Donald Trump, it'll probably get worse. What does that mean for their aims and ambitions in the region? And could that actually draw the United States in even further into the Middle East militarily?
Well, I think there are three sources of concern when we look at the possibility, the risks of escalation in the Middle East that could pull the United States in, as you say. The first is this new position of weakness that Iran finds itself in. Its allies have crumbled. Its position is in full retreat. It has no alternative source of conventional deterrence. And this is going to put a lot of pressure on the regime to consider a nuclear deterrent as the only conceivable alternative, to keep their position, not only their regional position, but also the position of the regime. The regime looks weak. And there is an active conversation, an active discussion inside Iran. Look at Libya. Look at Syria. Look what happened there. Now look at North Korea. What's the difference? And there's an increasing openness this year in 2024 to discussing the possibility of building a nuclear weapon. Even that discussion happening in public is notable. It did not occur in public before. So there is a real possibility that Iran moves to a bomb on the basis of its weakened position. The other two elements of concern, as you note, the makeup of the likely Trump national security team. Trump himself likes to talk about a deal with Iran. If I had to venture a guess, I would say that he looks on a deal as preferable to military action. He imagines himself a deal maker. He imagines himself as a bringer of peace. He also sees himself as someone who can come in and clean up Joe Biden's mess. And to some extent, Barack Obama's mess, right? He likes to imagine that a better deal is possible under him than was possible under Obama. That being said, every one of his appointees suggests to me that a return to maximum pressure is base case in 2025.
Yep.
In order to negotiate, you need a team. You need individuals who are willing to work towards that goal. And no one that Trump has selected has really suggested openly that they're even comfortable with the idea of negotiating with the Islamic Republic of Iran, except perhaps in a position of overwhelming strength. And this gets to our third source of potential concern, Israel. Israel is on a roll, let us say. It has issued blow after blow against Iran's allies.
Let's pull up this map really quickly, Greg. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just want to give people another visual aid here of what Israel has done over the past less than 2 weeks, as you say. There is the illegally occupied Golan Heights, which is internationally recognized as Syrian territory, but Israel has been in control of it and occupying it for decades. They have moved past. Apparently, the Golan Heights used to be the buffer zone for Israel between the terrorist hordes in Syria, and now they need a buffer zone for the buffer zone. You can see how they have taken even more territory over the past 2 weeks. That's just the context. And as you're saying, Gregory, they have also been bombing all of Syria's military sites during this process.
Right. So it does. It speaks to an Israeli position that is emboldened, that is confident. It's not only the campaign in Syria that we've seen play out over the last couple of days. It's the success of the war in Lebanon. I don't think it can really be sugarcoated that Israel has won a victory, perhaps not a complete victory, against Hezbollah in Lebanon. There was also the success of the strike against Iran in October, which feels like ancient history now because of so much has happened since. but Israel was able to do significant damage to Iran's military infrastructure in October and has suffered no retaliation as a result. So Iran looks weak, and this naturally gives Israel more of greater scope for undertaking more actions against Iran that could potentially mean actions against its internal infrastructure, its military position. It could potentially mean an Israeli strike against the nuclear program that comes without direct U.S. involvement. Now, the scholarly consensus, the consensus in the analytical community, is that the U.S. has to be involved in order to drop bombs that are large enough to destroy the Iranian program. But we've seen Israel more willing to take risks. We've seen Israel more willing to strike against Iran from a position of strength. And that gives, I think, greater, increases the risks of an escalation in 2025 that could pull the United States in. If Israel feels that it has scope and opportunity to strike a blow against Iran, to remove what Israel regards as the existential threat of Iran's nuclear program, I think there's a chance that they'll go for it, knowing that Trump will likely have their back.
Yeah, and that is a terrifying prospect. It's a remarkable turn of events in the sense that Israel looked a lot weaker than it did, I would say, prior to the events over these past 3 to 4 weeks. First, the Lebanon ceasefire was a way, frankly, because they inflicted so much damage on the civilian population within Lebanon, they brought Hezbollah to the table and reached a deal with them without addressing the genocide in Gaza, which was why Hezbollah had started launching their rockets on October 8th, was in response to and in solidarity with Hamas and with the people in Gaza as well. And they were able to reach a deal with them without addressing that, without reaching a ceasefire in Gaza. And then now, with this turn of events, Assad, brutal, all of that as you described, but like another domino that falls where Hezbollah was severely weakened, and then Assad, another ally for Iran, now in Moscow.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're looking at Israel's position now versus what it was a few months ago, it is undoubtedly stronger. The goal of Israel against Hezbollah was the separation of the fronts, right? Reaching a conclusion or at least some kind of ceasefire or agreement on the northern border with Lebanon without having to conclude operations in Gaza or reach a ceasefire agreement with Hamas. And now that's been accomplished. And I think moving into 2025, the larger goal for Israel, and Netanyahu has said this, is to address the threat of Iran. Right? Consistently, we hear from Israel that the real problem, the real threat, is not Hezbollah, is not Hamas, but it is Iran. And given that they're likely to receive support from Trump in 2025, given that Iran looks very weak, given that Iran's conventional deterrence has been stripped away, that puts Israel in a pretty strong position to do what it's been doing so far: use military force to remove potential threats and strengthen its own position.
Lastly, before we let you go, the Turkey's role in this. They are a NATO ally, but there were reports earlier, I think maybe yesterday, that the U.S.-backed forces and Turkish forces had come into conflict with one another. Obviously, this presents an issue given that allegiance via NATO for Turkey and the United States. What does Erdogan want here, and does it present a potential conflict with the U.S.?
It's interesting. Before coming on, I saw a tweet from, I think, maybe the U.S. Spokesman, John Kirby, that said the United States is in contact with Turkey and is in contact with the SDF. And I thought that was interesting because currently Turkish proxies in Syria are fighting the SDF and pushing them back. This speaks to Turkey's position regarding the situation in Syria. What Turkey wants, what Erdogan wants, it's really three things. The first is some kind of new political status quo in Syria that permits the return of Syrian refugees. There are something like 3 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, and Erdogan wants them to return to Syria. That is one of his priorities. So establishing some kind of normalization with whatever government emerges in Damascus is a goal for him. I think the more important, though, and more immediate goals are addressing the security threat that Turkey feels is posed by the existence of the SDF across the border in Syria. There are, of course, Kurdish groups, Kurdish factions that are operating in Turkey that the Turkish government perceives as being a threat to Turkish security. The SDF being present in Syria has long been regarded by Turkey as a threat to Turkish security. Turkey is using its groups, its proxies, its allies in Syria, the Syrian National Army, to push back against the SDF. And in the event that the US withdraws, as I mentioned, Turkey is likely to push even harder against the SDF to try to force them into some kind of new arrangement, some kind of new status quo that reduces their autonomy, that reduces their military strength, that forces them into a coalition with whatever government is present in Damascus. That would accomplish Erdogan's goals. And right now, he seems to be on track of accomplishing them. It's a little hard to pick clear winners. I mean, as I mentioned, there are clear losers. But if I had to pick a clear winner from what's happened in Syria over the last 2 weeks, it is Turkey and Erdogan. He appears to be in line, on track to accomplish what he wants to accomplish in Syria.
Well, really appreciate your analysis and your time today. Gregory Brew, a senior analyst at Eurasia Group, focusing on Iran and energy. Really appreciate you coming on today. Thanks so much.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.